your colleague, Dr. John Hope. I don't know if you know him or not, but Dr. John Hope.
I have not met him personally, no.
Okay. Excellent book. I highly recommend it. Anyone listening to the program, if you're interested in sports and racism, Darwin's Athlete, fantastic. But when he was on the program, Mr. Patterson, when you were saying racial volleyball, when they talk about these stories in the media, Dr. Hoberman's term was racial theater. He said anytime you have anything like what happened with Ron Artest and the fight in Detroit a few years ago, or the whole Dr. Henry Louis Gates, it just becomes racial theater, something where we can sit around and wring our hands about, oh my gosh, we've got this problem with race, or the opportunity to celebrate, oh, we've made so much progress, things are so much better than before when we were having, lynchings and dogs in the streets and when it was really very messy. And he said, just as you said, that there really is no resolution, it's just racial theater. He also said, he cited Rocky specifically, even in his book. He said that he felt that in sports you've had this rise of black dominance in many, many different sports, and it's caused a lot of dissonance for white people. And he said that you have certain acts that try to soothe the conscience of white people who are bothered by seeing so many black athletes dominating. He said he felt Rocky was one way to soothe the white conscience. And he said, you have these series that they're still going. They just had one a couple years ago where you have this white fighter who generally is fighting a non-white fighter and eventually wins the day, beats the guy down, triumphs, and you get to feel good. Very emotional films. And race is generally front and center in these films. I even noted with Dr. Hoberman, the most recent film that came out, I think just 3 years ago, the black fighter's name in the film is Mason the Line Dixon.
Correct.
That's his name in the film. And even if you rewind back to the third Rocky installment, Mr. T's character, he's referenced as an ape. Before Rocky's trainer dies, he calls him an ape. Just his entire character it's kind of, that whole film is just kind of difficult to watch. It's not a very good film in the first place, but he doesn't even have lines at some point. He's basically just grunting at the camera and giving you this savage black brute that needs to be domesticated. If either one of you can go first for your views on Rocky.
Well, I haven't seen Rocky 3, but what you just summarized, and I've seen parts of it going through the channels enough to say that's right on. And the one I've seen most recently is the Rocky Balboa from around 2007 with Mason the Line Dixon. And in terms of various ways in which this film in Professor Hoberman's words soothes the anxiety of the white audiences about sort of the rise to prominence of the black athlete in the sport, is that it begins. Well, the very first thing is you hear the solid chanting for Rocky, 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 and then you see Mason the Line Dixon punching someone out. But it's all followed by audience dissatisfaction. You think about racial theater. Racial theater is all about an immediate relationship to an audience, and the bottom line message is: look, this is a sport where now it's dominated by black athletes. And therefore, the whole sport has been devalued. There's all these commentators saying that, nothing thrills us anymore. There's even, they say Mason the Line Dixon, he's just beating a bunch of, quote, bums is the term that is used. And that term comes back again later in the movie when Paulie is making racist remarks about a young black man. Says he dresses like a bum. So there's a way in which there's kind of even it starts out with kind of a sour grapes relationship with the audience to this sport that, maybe the black athletes are dominating it, but we don't think it's so great anyhow. And so that's why it just sets up for Rocky. We need someone with passion who will thrill us. What I thought was fascinating is that it's first played out via a computer simulation. The computer simulation becomes the stage for that fantasy of racial theater to be staged and imagined first, and it's in that digital realm that it's played out, and the white body is portrayed as containing and triumphing over the threat of the black body, contained within that computer simulation. but again, to go back to the racial theater thing, the thing for me about this Rocky Balboa movie is the cuts to the reaction shots of various audiences and their reactions. It's an ESPN then versus now, computer simulation, and they cut to two different audiences. One is this Irish pub, and it's marked as an Irish pub, and it's a bunch of white people cheering for Rocky and cheering for the people who are saying Rocky is the greatest. And they're all out in public and sort of celebrating this moment of even anticipating the big Rocky comeback. I think it's interesting. I'll just say it's also interesting that it's Irish. It's interesting that Rocky is marked as Italian. You have Rocky and his manager, Paulie, who are both kind of marked as Italian American, although Paulie works for Shamrock Meats. And there's a way in which it's not just white people versus non-white people, but it's white people who have a semi-recent anxiety even about their status to whiteness. That is, they're ethnic whites, right, who are wanting to consolidate their access to white privilege or have anxieties about losing it. Anyhow, I see that there's this kind of Irish-Italian thing. I mean, just as Mason the Lion Dixon is objectified, in that racial history way, it's a strange way in which Rocky also is objectified. In an animal way, he's the Italian stallion, right? And the movie, in a way, is about him purifying that. Just as Mr. T is compared to an ape, Rocky is, compared to this, this horse, that would be seen as someone ride the horse or anyhow. But he's got this animal, but he keeps using the phrase, the beast, throughout this movie, Rocky Balboa, and he specifically uses it when he's talking to Paulie. And finally, at the end, he says, I finally got rid of the beast. I finally sort of got that beast out of me. Even when he talks about sort of nostalgia about his first fight in Rocky I, when he's fighting Apollo Creed, he says, I went after him like I was an animal, right? I was fighting like an animal. So he sees himself in those animal terms initially, but I think the movie is about undergoing this violent ritual, purifying himself of the beast, and he does that with the encounter and testing his body, improving his body against the black man. Oh, I was going to say, I sidetracked myself, and then I'll say the one last thing about the racial theater. That ESPN computer simulation has two audiences, right? One is there's featured the Irish pub crowd, and then just sort of Mason Dixon's own crew, just in their own sort of headquarters or space. You don't see anybody publicly sort of cheering for Mason Dixon. It's like the only people who would be his friends who would cheer for him are the ones who are in his entourage. You don't see like any parallel scene of another pub, of any sort of racial makeup where people are cheering for the black fighter. Rocky's all Rocky. That's the audience. That's what the audience goes for.
That's oftentimes continuing on the theme of minority isolation. In a lot of these movies, either if there is a large population or a larger group of non-white characters in a movie, typically there are going to be completely background characters, i.e., hey, it's Last Samurai, and we have to be in Japan with Asian characters, or it's used again to show this visual threat in terms of, hey, here we are, in the hood, and all of a sudden, these non-white characters appear out of nowhere, and now we have to navigate around them or thwart them or dispose of them, kind of like Kill Bill, where again she's, Uma Thurman cuts through, 100+ Asian characters, within a matter of a couple minutes. And to dip back in, I think that was well stated in terms of the Rocky analysis, and I'll actually dip outside of the movie context to also talk about real-world examples. I think Raging Bull, another boxing movie, if I'm not mistaken, the opening scene of that has De Niro as a white boxer, obviously also beating a black boxer down in the beginning of that movie. And again, when I say black, I mean, you just talk about this ape-like character or this other. I'm talking about looking like blackface with, white eyes. And again, De Niro basically beating him down in the beginning of that movie. And actually, thinking back, because I think this is good for some of the for some of the listeners out there, just in terms of, is it racist or is it just wrong? I think about the real world story of Jack Johnson, the boxer, right? And for anybody that hasn't seen the story, I actually recommend, there's a movie, Unforgivable Blackness, the rise and fall of Jack Johnson, who was a heavyweight fighter, black heavyweight in the early 1900s, first black heavyweight championship, and he was convicted in this is real world context, convicted in 1913 because he had a relationship with a white woman. And I think this is actually an important detail because it talks about, I think it gives us an eye towards this relativism that we're always in as we move through history, because we're kind of always at the eye of the storm and we can only get perspective 2020. I don't think at the time, and I don't even think if we look at civil rights, kind of the height of racism, if we want to call it that, of the peak of open-faced racism maybe, I don't know if the agents that were carrying out these racist acts defined themselves as racist. I don't recall, reading, and maybe they did. I just don't recall seeing like literature, even if you take it to the extreme of like KKK. I don't recall them defining themselves as, hey, we're racist and we're proud of it. No, they were talking about things like white power and authority and maintaining their position relative to somebody else. And in the case of Jack Johnson, when he was charged with the crime, I don't think anybody said openly, guess what, we're charging you with the crime because it's racist, because it's the crime of racism, or that this goes on the books as a racist move. If anything, the idea was we're going to do it and we're not going to say that it's about race. I mean, that's what separate but equal is. I mean, Jim Crow, the idea is by the letter of the law, I'm able to say that you have equal resources. In practice, I maintain the hierarchy, but if we refer back to the books, it's not going to say, oh, yes, this was a racist act. And I think that's important for, again, not just young people, but I always speak as being a younger person. I think it's important for us to understand, because now when we look and we think about racism, we define racism as, oh, yeah, the barking dogs and the fire hoses. And that's incorrect. That actually is evidence of you triggering the alarm of the racist system, right? In other words, if you were okay, if you didn't drink from the water fountain, if you didn't protest, you were already experiencing racism. It's just that you weren't doing anything about it. And so what we think now is the racist act of the violence or the lynching, no, those were actually crude ways of making sure that you didn't trigger the system. And if you watch mainstream movies especially, as Dr. Keovorkian hinted, oftentimes this cartoonish violence that we see, this virtual voodoo of black images, especially black, I'll say, it's non-white images, but particularly black in a lot of instances, that virtual voodoo is, again, a reminder and a continuation of this theme, right? The lynching wasn't, I mean, think about it. If white people wanted to get rid of black people or other non-white people in this country, they could have done it a long time ago. Easy. No problem. They can still do that today, right? But the thing is, again, it's not that I don't need you here, it's that I need you to be in your place. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's the same way in the movies, right? I actually want you to be in the movies, right? I mean, that's why I have the Chris Rocks, the Chris Tuckers, the Jackie Chans. I want you to be in my movies because you bring a certain thing that I can't do, or a certain element that I can't reproduce on my own. But the problem is, again, if you get out of line, that's when I need to shut you down, and that's when I need to, again, what happens? We close where we began. What happens when Will Smith or Chow Yun-Fat tries to make his move towards a white female? That's when I need to strike you down with violence or otherwise block you, like you said, the physics. I mean, that's when I need to remind you that gravity still exists, and that I need you grounded while I go to the moon.
Yeah, Mr. Renegade, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Yeah, I know the show is shutting down. I really did want to emphasize the point about the fantasy, because the subconscious mind, we know from the science of neurology, the brain cannot differentiate between real-time images and what it sees in a two-dimensional way that's simulated, whether it's on a computer screen, a film, or TV. So that if, under the context of white supremacy, all film is racial theater. And so those images really serve to reinforce the unified behavior that needs to be conducted by white racist man and racist woman who have to be white people in order to maintain the supreme system. And it is my theory that the core of it, of course, just as the guest just said, is sexual, and that the power that is maintained is ultimately for the purposes of sexual domination. And that's why that basic law of physics always comes into play with the use of violence. And you see that so much with the absolute equation in film of guns and penises. Particularly, you see that really demonstrated very well in the film The Departed, that they use a very coarse language and make it really clear that the white male's penis and the gun are one and the same, that it's power. It's the power to be able to enter a female womb. And I think it's really important to know that is the core message in all images, which cannot be differentiated in the brain between fantasy and real time.
Can I ask Cree Seven? Is this Cree Seven? Am I saying that correctly?
Yes, it is.
Yes. Did you see Rocky Balboa?
I did see that last film. Yes.
Because I'm thinking of the Little Marie character in terms of your thesis of just sort of who has access to the white woman's body, and it seems like there's an element of Rocky Balboa that, on the one hand, wants to suggest Rocky's sort of openness to racial difference, to whites and non-whites, in that. Do you have comments about Little Marie and her son and the way that that's handled in the film?
It's been such a long time since I've seen that.
Okay. Yeah. So what basically occurs is Little Marie is someone from Rocky's neighborhood, a young white woman who's now grown up, and Rocky has now befriended her and is going to kind of take care of her, and he gets to meet her son. She already has a child, and she explains that the father was Jamaican, and it's played so that Rocky is meant to come across as sort of tolerant or understanding, or doesn't have a problem with this, and he befriends the young man, despite the fact that contradictorily, as I said, Paulie has kind of racist, bigoted things to say about the young man, and Rocky kind of lets that slide on the other hand, but. It's an instance where sort of, we see this young woman who has had a relationship across racial lines, but it's dramatic that the black father is never shown in this movie, and that Rocky, in this sort of paternalistic way, has to take over and be the protector of her. And there's even an implication, it's kind of indirect, but there's an implication that she's been taught to disrespect herself, and it never comes out and says who did it or how it did it, but she kind of says something at one point that suggests a low self-image, and Rocky says, who taught you that? Who taught you that? Someone must have put that in your head, right? And like he's the one who's going to respect her in the right way.
And then, of course, as I do recall, she was really living a life where she didn't have resources because she had been sexually intimate with a black male.
Yeah, she was outside. She was outside the access to resources, yeah.
And then Rocky comes into the picture as the strong, white, virile black male with both financial and physical resources with his bull-like fists that represent testicles. And he might be able to...
and his black sweatshirt, right?
Right.
Which though, it's a black sweatshirt that says Dempsey on it, right? It's all about nostalgia for these white fire. It also invokes the Rocky Marciano thing that was mentioned before. There's nostalgia for that, for sure. Yeah. Sorry.
I think that one thing that we that I think was very interesting in terms of Rocky Balboa, and I haven't seen the movie itself, even though I know the storyline and the theme. But I think what's also interesting in that what both the Doctor and Cree talked about is that there is a theme of Rocky is white, but he's also like Italian first, or like it's like 1A and 1B. And in many respects, we see this as a way to also, again, make the racial dynamic or the racial subtext or the racism, in some cases, easier to digest for the white audience, the primary white audience that, again, at this point in time wants to be race neutral or at least claim that they're not racist, right? So in other words, in being able to say, well, he's Italian American, I mean, yes, he's white, but I mean, he could be a little bit racist because he's Italian American. And you know what? I'm okay with that because he's kind of ethnic in his own way, even though he's kind of, he's kind of living in both worlds. And the other example I use as a hyperbole is, again, I go back to Tropic Thunder, which I think is a not so subtle drop in the fact that Robert Downey's character, who is in blackface during the movie, is not just an average quote-unquote white guy, but that he's Australian, right? And that in having him be Australian, basically that means that, oh, okay, well, yeah, I mean, he's racist, but, I mean, he's not an average American like me, i.e. just a white, average white person with no accent. Because if he was, then I might actually have to kind of turn the mirror back on myself and say, well, what does this mean about me if I'm able to identify with this character completely?
Wow. I am only interrupting because we only have 3 hours and the show is about to close down. I am thrilled and extremely grateful that Dr. Keovorkian and Mr. Paterson, that you both were able to participate in this program. I think it was phenomenal. All of the callers and folks who had questions or just listening on the line, thank you for tuning into the broadcast. Outstanding. Please check out minorityreporter.com. Minority Reporter.
Yes, please. You can reach us at editor@minorityreporter.com. You can text me if you have any questions after the show. I'm at 310-936-8961. You can visit us on the website, Facebook us, Twitter. Please reach out so we can continue the conversation. And I thank you for having me on the program, and thank you, Doctor, as well, for your commentary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Paterson. Thank you very much, Gus, for setting this up. It's just been an absolute privilege to be able to participate in this conversation. As I said to Gus via email, that the book, You Mean There's Race in My Movie, is just packed with sharp observations. And in light of what you were saying about contacting you via Minority Report, I like the idea that you say it's what you call an open text. You have that metaphor that it invites people into the conversation, and I think it's just a great model to look at for thinking about race and culture.